Content warnings include mention of pulse shootings towards the beginning of the episode and adoption and child abuse mentions in relation to the plot of the film.
Greetings. You are listening to Horror Nerds at Church, a podcast where we take a deep dive into a horror film and talk about what it can teach us about God, the Bible, and each other. My name is Joe, and I am the child with psychic powers that nobody wanted. So they shoved me into a well where I'm currently broadcasting to you from. Oh, and also I'm dead. So I'm speaking to you not so much from beyond the grave, but beyond the well, as it were.
Are you using your psychic abilities to imprint this message onto a recording of a VHS of old analog technology that is no longer useful?
Well, that's how we record podcasts today, Pace.
Yes. I am Pace, and the I am Captain Jack Sparrow, but I'm lost in the wrong Gore Verbinski film.
That's clever. I love it. So, how are you doing, Captain Sparrow?
I'm exhausted. How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm on and off, exhausted. I've been depressed. It has, it's biologically depressed, exacerbated by circumstances in real life.
Mm,
So, I've also been exhausted. Haven't had much energy except to do the things I really want to do. Like writing my thesis, that excites me. Co-hosting this podcast with you, that excites me. But if it's something like, I don't know, I have to go return a library book or something, girl, it'll take me like 300 years just to get off the couch and another 300 years to get to the library.
And you work at the library too, so it's not like you can just take it with you when you go to work.
That makes it worse, Pace. No. Well, I'm so
Love it.
sorry to hear that you're so exhausted.
Yeah, I don't know. It's been a month. We are recording this. This is our first podcast. We're recording our first episode. We're recording in July,
Yeah.
so we just finished Pride Month, and for some reason,
Mm,
Pride Month, ever since the Pulse shootings, I was talking with my friends about this. Like, it has just become so exhausting,
yeah. Yeah.
and it's just like constant. The constant. A lot of it is social media. Just the constant need to educate people who say they're allies and stuff, but just that constant education you need to give so that they show up in the ways and
Mm,
spaces that queer people actually want, as opposed to just coming to like gay pride and gay bars for parties and stuff. So
yeah.
it's exhausting.
No,
But
Go ahead.
I was just gonna say, but now today is the 4th of July that we're recording on. So we go
Mm,
from a very queer holiday to a very capitalistic, imperialistic,
primar-
colonialist holiday.
primarily cis het white.
Yeah.
Absolutely vanilla, the polar opposite of pride.
Yes.
Oh man.
So what about you?
Go
You're talking
persons.
about you feeling down and stuff, but what else is
Yeah.
going on, or is that just mostly the funk we've both been in? It sounds
It's
like.
just mostly the funk. You're right though about pride, and it's not just having to like explain things to non-queer people. It's the fact that it seems to happen every year, and
Yeah.
like what's happening that the message isn't sinking in because we know we're doing our part. We're literally feeling exhausted. But like what is this tacit refusal for our experiences to be completely heard? Is it like
Right.
I
And
don't
then
know. Yeah.
we also have our infighting in the community where we have like the
Right.
poster boys for gay pride being essentially white,
Mhm.
able-bodied, fairly skinny or muscular white gay men. And it's
Mhm.
like always trying to get them on board with true queer liberation is a mess too. And it's like,
Mhm.
oh my God. Pride doesn't mean just going to um, the pride parade
Right.
in a leather harness and no shirt, and then you're done and you've done your pride for the year.
Although there's
Amen.
absolutely
You want
nothing
more of that.
wrong with that, especially the leather harness part.
No, of course not. We love. Oh yes. Oh yes. But
But
we
yeah,
absolutely love our pride. But yes, it is more than just looking skimpy and drinking a lot,
absolutely.
which is what I feel like has kind of become in certain pockets of the queer community.
Yeah.
So,
Yeah.
so we'd like to invite all of you to this episode of horror horror nerds at Pride Parade, or the elder horror gay queer nerds bitching about Pride, and the younger one. I don't know. Whatever this new segment is we're gonna do. Let's just bitch about queer shit for the first half of the podcast.
Let- Let's do it. Do you really want to spend the first half of the podcast bitching about queerness? Oh, girl, because I could go on for days.
I know we should probably spare our audience, but maybe we'll have a special episode one of these days. That's what we should do. Because October is the National Coming Out Month. We
It
should do a special
is.
Pride or queer episode sometime.
Eh, That sounds great. I would love to do that.
Yeah, audience, if you're listening to us and you want to hear our spicy queer takes, let us know and we'll do something fun about that. We'll do something fun.
Yeah. Well,
Okay, well, if you didn't catch on by looking at the episode title, today we are covering The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski.
mm,
Came out in 2002. It's a remake of the 1998 Japanese film Ringu, which itself is based on a 1991 novel of the same name by Koji
mhm,
Suzuki.
mm.
What is your first memories of this film? And also, because you picked this one, why don't you say a few words about why you picked it?
Sure. I just want to say right off the bat, I love this movie. I think The Ring 2002 is my Halloween. You know how like you are just in love with the Halloween franchise?
Yep,
Like
yep.
like this is me with this one movie. um I absolutely love this movie. And so when we do our walkthrough, as you can see, I from my outline, it's a mini paper. um, but part of the reason why the walkthrough is going to be lengthier than usual is because this movie, I think, is structured as exposition followed by action. And under ordinary circumstances, that much exposition would, be a very boring movie. But I found this movie to be so artful that the exposition weaves in really naturally with the rest of the movie to make like a very organic singular movie. And that being said, this movie came out in 2002. I was in college, and uh, the unique thing about my college experience is that this was my first time being surrounded in a nearly completely Asian American community. I was raised in a Black adjacent neighborhood, and that was the majority. That was the majority population that I interacted with a, a few Asians here and there, but nothing like at San Francisco State University, which is where I did my undergrad. And so I had access to really interesting Asian cultural things that were not mainstream yet, and therefore my friends who I had left behind, they didn't know about these things yet. And it's so funny because nowadays everybody likes boba. Everybody likes anime. But when I went to college, none of my friends knew about that stuff. And I was like hearing it up close and personal for the very first time. And so it's through that I discovered that there, at least in the Eastern Asian countries, so Japan and Korea, the latest movie trend was horror, and that they were doing it really well. And from what I understood of the American movie industry, they were just picking up on what was so successful in Asia. So, as part of the Asian American community at my undergrad, I actually saw a lot of the original movies before they were remade by the Americans. And the remakes were of varying quality, of course, but The Ring, directed by Gore Verbinski, absolutely stands out from all of them. And my first reaction to the movie was I didn't think it was good. You know why? Because I thought it was good, but I didn't phrase it that way. My expression of the movie being good was I was terrified the fuck out of my mind. Okay, I'm like
Love
nine. I'm like 19 years old, and this movie just like terrified me. I still very vividly remember when we went back home. I did not want to be anywhere near the TV. Yeah. And we saw it on the opening weekend too, so packed movie theater.
Love it. That's really cool. Trying to remember, like I'm trying to decide, do I want to drag my mom a little bit or not? But I
Uh,
can always have it edited out. So I'll just tell the story.
Personal
Um
choice, my friend.
yeah. I see Techie Cocoa Puff has something to say before I get into my story. What do you have to
Oh,
say?
okay.
Okay. I think we left off. We had a brief interruption from our editor, but I think we left off where I was just deciding if I was going to tell a story that would drag my mom a little bit or not. And I think I'm going to, and we can always edit it out if we need to.
Okay.
So I've told the story before about how when I was growing up as a little kid, I was
Mm,
exposed to horror movies way before it would have typically been age appropriate. I remember going to
mhm.
the theater to see, like, with my parents, them thinking that I'd fall asleep during the movie and stuff. I've said all this before in the podcast. That's not the part that's dragging my mom, because I actually think that's cool. That gave me a lifelong love of horror, and I still love horror. But
Similar experience there with you, Pace, with my mom.
my mom got divorced from my dad when I was in elementary school.
Mm,
they She remarried when I was in middle school, and when she remarried, suddenly we were not allowed to watch R-rated movies anymore,
mm,
even though I was now at a more appropriate age to start watching R-rated movies.
mm.
So I really did not get much of a horror fix when I was in high school. It really wasn't until college I got my horror fix, with few exceptions. Movies like Mothman Prophecies with Richard Gere
Ooh, yes.
and The Ring 2002.
Mm,
Uh, both are rated PG-13, so I was allowed to watch those. So
mm.
this was like one of the few horror movies that I remember actually seeing in theaters when I was in high school. Was a sophomore or junior, somewhere in there in high school. So that's my first memory of this. I remember finding the mystery part, like it kind of has a little bit more of a, it's definitely a horror movie, of course, but it has a lot of like procedural and X-Files kind of elements
Right.
to it.
Yeah.
And so I remember really liking that the first time I saw it, but other than that, not particularly caring about it one way or the other.
Mm,
Um,
mhm,
so watching this for the podcast is probably my first time rewatching it since I was in theaters. So like first time in 20 years almost.
mhm.
So yeah.
That that's a great background on your first experience with this movie, and I don't think you were dragging your mom.
Well, dragging her that sudden, like, she was apparently irresponsible in like conventional ways. I don't think she was irresponsible, but
Oh,
conventionally it was irresponsible to show an elementary schooler and younger like R-rated films.
sure.
But then to stop that once you get remarried to somebody, like, who are you trying to impress? Your new husband? What's going on there? Why aren't we
Right.
allowed to watch R-rated movies? I've never figured that out.
So you think your mom changed herself for the marriage, like gave up an authentic part of herself?
Or tried to um try to put on a better, more conventional mom
Mm,
kind of role
I got you.
after the divorce. Because part of it was like I was a latchkey kid for until high school, essentially, because
Yeah.
my both my mom and when my mom was raising me as a single mom, of course that was different. And then when she married, she still was working all the time, being a pastor. That's she had really strange hours, a lot of evening hours for evening meetings and stuff.
Hmm.
And my stepfather uh often wouldn't be home when we would get home from school either until like 6 o'clock or dinner time.
Yeah.
So there was that kind of like golden window where I could kind of sneak in some horror and stuff like that and watch
Mm,
the stuff I wasn't allowed to watch.
yeah.
But by and large, like by the time I got to high school, like we weren't allowed to watch horror movies or rated R movies really. with a few exceptions. Like I remember The Matrix was something I was allowed to watch, and I was
Mm-hmm.
allowed to watch Kill Bill.
Mm-hmm.
I so I don't I've just never really understood the logic, if there was any logic behind my mom's change in what was acceptable viewing material for her teenage child, but I don't know.
Well, what I think is interesting about your background here is that I always assumed that you had this completely uninterrupted involvement with the horror movie genre, and I didn't realize there was this little gap there.
No, it was. And what makes it especially wild is the movies that started to come out by the time I hit college were had changed a lot. Like horror as a genre had changed a lot from the Scream started to fade out towards the end, like that kind of era of slasher craze in the late
Hmm.
90s started to fade out. It started to get replaced in the early 2000s with what is kind of called torture porn as a subgenre of horror.
Right.
So imagine my shock going to see like the first horror film in my college career being, I think it was the Texas Chainsaw Massacre
Mm.
remake, or maybe it was something along those lines, or it could have been The Hills Have Eyes, that remake, one of those remakes that was just like so over the top graphic in a way that
Right.
horror hadn't. I mean, horror always had that. And I recently watched this is turning into a very long segment. I'm sorry, listener, but I'm almost done. But but I
It's
recently
fine.
watched Cannibal Holocaust, which is this movie that came out in 1980. It's really bizarre,
Mm.
and it is notorious for supposedly being one of the most gory and graphic horror films ever made. And watching it, it definitely was
Yeah.
graphic and disturbing, and but it also is like I feel like the early 2000s were trying to get back to that level of gore, and they also had the ability for computer animation to supplement special effects budgets and stuff like that to enhance like the gore and blood and all that. So the early 2000s was a really interesting time in horror. I think it was trying to find out what it wanted to be for the new millennia. um
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. I think you hit the nail on the head. I think one of the most salient takeaways of The Ring 2002 is that in many ways it was a transition movie. It was a transition movie in the growth of the horror genre as it tried to find its next um, identity. It is a depiction of technological artifacts that were on their way out. So yeah, no, you're right on the money. The if nothing else, the Ring I think plays a cultural role as a transitional movie.
Yeah. Um, and I think as we go through the walkthrough, we can get into some of the interesting choices because it really is like a hallmark, like you're saying, of a dying era of
Yeah.
VHS recordings and stuff like that. I mean, DVDs were on the rise then, and now we're Blu-ray and digital, and so it's like actual media that you can hold in your hand is becoming more and more of a dying thing.
Yeah.
Except for books, I think books are always going to be around, but
Yeah.
um,
No, when we were screening The Ring for this podcast, I actually watched it on my iPhone, and I thought to myself, I can't believe I have lasted this long on the planet, where I'm watching this movie from college here in the comfort of my own home in the palm of my hand. Like we are really living in the future. The other thing too, just to add to the point about this being a transitional movie, 2002. So the new millennium has just started, right? And then for those millennials of us of a certain age, we're going through a huge transformation. We're in college for those who chose to go to college. For those who choose to pursue whatever careers or whatever transitions changes from the first part
mhm.
of their lives. This is a transitional period. So yeah, this movie just stands for so many things that are shifting.
Yeah, I mean, the one of the hallmarks of being a millennial is just coming of age at in the post 9/11 aftermath and what that world looked like in the
Right.
especially northwestern hemispheres. But So that's just very interesting to me, how like as we're coming of age, these are the movies that are kind of this signals that, something, that an era is dying and something new is beginning. And The Ring
Yeah.
kind of purpose really interestingly captures that. One of the things that I'm sure we'll talk about more is the
Mm-hmm.
use of filters that Gore Verbinski did, like in the
Mm-hmm.
in the time after The Matrix, when they kind of put green filter over that movie, like suddenly it became all over the place that
Yeah.
everybody was doing it. And this film is no exception. The film is really, really heavy heavy use of filters. So it's like this really like washed out blue for a lot of the movie.
Yes.
There's
Mm-hmm.
a few scenes that are this really like vibrant green, and then some of the flashbacks are more the sepia tone.
Yeah.
And so like you're not actually seeing true color for almost the entire film. So that's kind of this transition into what film can become. We see a lot more of this
Mm-hmm.
now it's used, I think, a little bit more artfully than it was in this movie.
Mm-hmm.
But then we also are having a central plot point being this VHS tape,
Right.
which how many people in 2002 had VHS players? I think most people did in the United States. But by the end of that, by 2010, just a few years later, I think most VHS players are probably replaced with DVD players or Blu-ray or something else.
I wonder if there's anyone who is born after 2000 who's actually listening to this podcast. Do you know what a VHS is? A VCR? No. Uh, I'm thinking about what you're saying about the filtering, and that is a hit or miss, right? Um, a, a movie that relies this heavily on filters usually means that the quality of the movie itself isn't great. A bad script, a bad director. The Ring has neither of those. So for me, anyway, I feel like the coloring of the movie works in its favor. As a moody, scary movie. We are horror nerds at church, right? So it works as a horror movie. But in terms of a cultural artifact, and thank you also for bringing up that this is the post 9/11 period. This movie looks like it's in mourning, right? And
Mm,
this is the general feeling in the years immediately following 9/11. It's not just the horror movie industry that's trying to find its footing. The whole country is trying to figure out, like what is this? What are we? What is America? And the political forces obviously had their own idea of what America should be. America should go to war and, strike back at our enemies and oh yeah, also go shopping again. I'm not exaggerating. Youngins, our president literally told us to go back and shop because that's what was going to bring us back out of our funk.
I
um,
know.
yeah,
Capitalism will set us free, apparently.
yeah, apparently. So, if nothing else, I think I would describe The Ring 2002 as a really important cultural artifact. I mean, that might sound dramatic, but it's a really good stand-in for all of the transitions that were happening to everyone at that time. Were there any more reminiscences that you wanted to make about your first memories of the movie?
Now I think we're ready to dive in and
Sure.
start talking about the movie.
Okay. So this week it's a little bit different because I don't know if y'all have noticed, but Pace is usually the one who takes us on our walkthroughs of the movie, and they do an incredibly thorough job. And I thought maybe this week, maybe I'll do the walkthrough this time because I love this movie so much. As I was doing the walkthrough, I got halfway through it and I was like, how does Pace do this every freaking week? I was like, what do I put in this walkthrough? What do I not? So finally, I just decided to stop living up to Pace and decided to like just do this on my own in my own style. And so I want to open our walkthrough by just talking a little bit about the cast of this movie, because since you already brought it up earlier, Pace, about the changing nature of the horror movie industry, and the changing nature of the movie industry in general. During this period, there were a lot of adaptations going on. So, as I said earlier, America, Hollywood found out about the Asian horror movie genre, and saw that as the next big thing for American audiences. But it was also at this time that Disney was expanding, and so they connected with Studio Ghibli. Okay, we'll go with that. Audience, you can go ahead and correct me. So, which is the home of the famous anime director Miyazaki, and so Disney had um, acquired. Well, I don't think they acquired Studio Ghibli at this point, but they certainly had formed a partnership, and so they had bought a couple of Miyazaki's movies and re-released it into American cinemas, and also re-recorded the audio with an American cast. So under again
Yeah. If
under ordinary circumstances, um, importing a beloved foreign animated film and then re-recording all the voice tracks with American cast members and speaking in English as well is a recipe for disaster. But Disney did it so well. Like they really put thought into who to cast for
mm,
the American releases of these Miyazaki movies.
yeah.
You get Kirsten Dunst, you get Suzanne Plachette, and at one point, some who is she? She plays Samara. Davy Chase from Here in the Ring, who also, as we all know, is Lilo and Stitch, pops up in Spirited Away. And the voices are so good and very well cast that I sacrilegiously tell anime fans I prefer the American acquisitions of Miyazaki's movies. Claire Danes, Gillian
Yep.
Anderson, yeah, they were cast in some of these movies too, and so that's why I want to talk a little bit about the casting of The Ring, which is fairly impressive because industry wise, this remake happened in a hurry. So when Hollywood found out about the Asian horror industry, they really wanted to produce something out of that. And so they basically learned that The Ring was very popular at that time, made a lot of money at that time. And the thinking was, how do we put this all together? And uh, what I think that they came up with, basically on the spot is pretty reasonable. So we get Naomi Watts as the lead character. She plays Rachel Keller, who is a reporter for the Seattle Post Intelligencer, and she's definitely the big name star of this movie. Correct me if I'm wrong, Pace, but during this time, we're not seeing A-list stars in horror movies. I mean, Jamie Lee did come back for H2O, um, but other than the Scream movies, we're not getting any too notable names attached to these horror
Yeah.
movies, right?
Yeah, I would agree with that. I think some of the PG-13 kind of lighter fare horror movies, like
Mm,
we of course get Richard Gere and the aforementioned
right.
Mothman Prophecy and stuff, but most horror, I think you're absolutely right. And Naomi Watts, we can't forget, was like fresh off of Mulholland Drive, so she was like huge at this time.
Yeah, she was. Thanks for that reminder because I forgot about that. Which brings to mind the fact that maybe she wanted to do this as kind of a change of pace from, an artsy awards attracting movie like Mulholland Drive. So Naomi Watts is our big name here, but there's a lot of familiar faces too. Some character actors, some TV actors you might recognize. Amber Tamblyn opens up the movie, and she's been in many roles as a General Hospital fan, Pace. I must point out that she was on that show for many years.
If
um,
you're playing the drinking game at home, go ahead and take a shot because Joe has mentioned General Hospital.
I wouldn't be surprised if our audience has gone completely drunk listening to me bring up that show so often on our podcast. Um, and so Adam Brody, who was at that time well known for the OC, pops up randomly for some strange reason. His character doesn't even have a name. He's literally listed as teenager number one, and he's basically a plot device to drive along Naomi Watts' character's investigation of what's going on. And I can't tell if this was an interesting casting choice or like a cynical part to bring in the young people of this time. Like, how do you bring in someone like Adam Brody for, a 2-minute scene and he's nameless? That's so odd to me. Um, we get Brian Cox, a great character actor who's also been in a lot of movies. And
Mhm.
so the actor David Dorfman, it plays our friendly neighborhood child psychic, Aiden, who is
See,
Rachel's son. Were you going to say
I've
something, Pace?
yeah, I have a question about this character,
Yeah.
which maybe you can um help clear up. Is he supposed to be psychic? I have no idea what is going on. This
Yeah.
character of Aiden seems like an afterthought. He's drawing these weird, like semi-psychic pictures,
Hmm.
and he says really creepy things to his mom and calls her Rachel instead of mom.
Right.
And then, but like it never explains like why does he know so much about
Yeah.
Samara? Is it because he's psychic? Is it because his cousin died in the beginning? I have no idea.
Yeah.
That's one of the parts that really just makes me feel like it wasn't well thought out, or at least that part of the movie.
I agree with you. I agree that Aiden could have been better sketched out. But something you said earlier about how you enjoyed this movie as a procedural that reminded you of the X Files, and I agree with you there that The Ring works in that way. But of course, in procedurals, the characters who are part of the mystery, right? They often don't have a very deep the writing isn't too deep for them. They're just a
Mhm.
way to kind of structure the mystery and give our main characters something to do. So I'm
Yeah.
guessing, yeah, so like, Naomi Watts here is the star, and she has this mystery to solve, and oh, BTW, she has a possibly psychic child. But I definitely understand your frustration there. And as we walk through the movie, I'm going to share some of my theories about whether or not he might be psychic, or maybe this is just a lucky coincidence.
Yeah, please do. I'm so confused about him. One more thing I want to
Sure.
bring up about him in particular. Oh crap! Now I'm forgetting. Well, if I think of it, I'll bring it back. But yeah, otherwise,
Hmm.
keep going.
Okay. Oh, maybe Aiden
Oh,
sucked it out of you.
I
Your
remember.
thoughts.
Yes,
Ah.
that's what happened. So first of all, I think his character is supposed to be kind of a little bit like they picked a kid that looks and sounds and kind of has a spooky element, like from what is that movie? Now I'm forgetting it.
Creepy kids. Let's go. The
Brad.
Sixth Sense. No.
Yes, that's it.
No way. Really?
Yes, that's what I was thinking of. So it definitely feels like it's supposed to be like their take on the Sixth Sense kid.
Hmm.
The other thing though is I'm not too familiar with the source material, either the novel or the original Japanese film. I did
Hmm.
see the Ringu,
Hmm.
or Ringu as it's called, once, like
Hmm.
back in college. So it's been a very long time. But I don't think there was that character in there at all. I think that this is one of the American adaptations that
Yeah.
is created whole cloth or whole cloth, whatever, for this movie. So
I agree. No, I'm with you there because I also saw Ringu in college and I don't remember it either through the passage of time or there might have been alcohol involved. I don't know. I but yeah, there is definitely a unique look to Aiden, which I think sort of explains the trajectory of the actor's real life. So David Dorfman successfully survived child stardom, and actually was a prodigy. He got admitted into college at 11 years old, and then he graduated and went to law school, and now he works as legal counsel in Washington D.C. I pulled up a recent picture of him. He has a headshot on one of the political websites, and he doesn't look like Aiden anymore. Thank goodness. um, but yeah, I think that a little bit of his precociousness, the actor's precociousness, might have been sliding into the character of Aiden. Speaking of child stars, I regret to inform you that Davy Chase, who plays Samara, our ghost who haunts us all, she had kind of a more rocky, rocky life as she got older, and the only way to summarize that is to say that she fell in with the wrong crowd. That's
Oh,
really the best way to describe that situation. And I hope that things get better for her because she's a talented actress. I mean, she did the Leela voice very well. I buy her as this tortured ghost who used to be a tortured human. And according to her credit, she also popped up in the HBO series. Um, what was it called? Pace, the one about the conservative Mormons who live big something.
Big Love, I think, or
Big
something
Love,
like that.
yes, yeah. She popped up on there as one of the wives of one of the husbands. So she was able to score some pretty good acting gigs, but she hasn't been on the scene in a while. Some notes about Gore Verbinski. Speaking to your introduction today, Pace, about Captain Sparrow. Yeah, Verbinski did go on to work on the Pirates of the Caribbean franchise, and I think it's interesting that that's the route he chose because The Ring is his third movie, and his first movie as a director was Mouse Hunt in
I
1997. Do you remember that?
love that movie.
Did you? Yeah, I never got to see it, but it looks so cute. I
It
feel like
is adorable.
I
It is
feel
definitely like a kids movie, so,
yeah,
like, I saw it at the right age where it, like, worked for me, but,
right.
even as an adult going back to watch it every now and again, it's still pretty cute.
Right. I'm an overgrown child, so I love anything that's like super cute. And I would definitely like to go back and watch Mouse Hunt sometime. But then his second movie ends up being The Mexican with Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts. That is a decidedly not family oriented movie.
Nope.
Um, the Mexican actually is a movie of different genres. It's one of those movies. It's hard to peg, but it's some kind of a mafia love story. Did you ever see The Mexican?
Yeah, I remember getting a lot of press, and then I saw it and was disappointed.
Yeah, yeah. No, me too, girl. I remember I went to the movie theater. I saw this at the movies because I was excited at the prospect of Brad Pitt and Julia Roberts being in the movie. Spoiler alert, they don't even have scenes until like towards the end of the movie. Like they're
Mhm.
working separately for the entire movie. I do remember that one of the best parts of the Mexican was the late James Gandolfini, who he's so missed. I missed him. I mean, everyone knows him
Mhm.
as Tony Soprano, but he could be a chameleon, and you don't expect a big guy like him to like be a chameleon, right? Like you'd expect him to be typecasted as a mafia like character, but I've seen him. He had so much range. At any rate, so for his third movie, Verbinski decided to go the horror route, and I feel like he too was finding his way until he decided that Pirates of the Caribbean was the way to go, quite possibly because it was a Disney franchise and he knew he'd make buck, right? So that's interesting too. So let's get to the movie. This was a DreamWorks production, and at that time, DreamWorks Studio was a very new studio. And in fact, Verbinski's first two movies were with DreamWorks. So with The Ring, he continues his partnership um, with DreamWorks. The production logo plays, and there's video tracking interference. So already from the production logo, we're being sucked in to the world of The Ring. Um, I should note, Pace, that when we screened this movie together, I watched it on my Bluetooth headset, and that gave me the ability to really appreciate, the audio art of this
Mm,
movie. Audio art? Did I say audio art?
yes.
I mean sound design.
How pretentious do you want to make it sound?
It sounds so basic. Oh, and well, I mean, I am a basic human being anyway. So, yeah, I appreciated the sound design of this movie. And the whole, like, first 5 minutes of the movie is a cold open. Um, and that kind of tactic was made famous, I think, by the Scream movies, where they'd have, like, a mini movie at the beginning, and then you'd have the real movie going forward. And so
Hmm.
remember Halloween H2O did that with Joseph Gordon-Levitt being in the little mini movie
Yep.
that could totally stand out on its own. And so The Ring opens up with its own mini movie. We have two teenagers, two typical 16-year-old girls named Katie and Becca, and they're watching TV. And interestingly, the opening dialogue for this movie is Katie, played by Amber Tamblyn, giving this like lecture, not a lecture, of a philosophical discussion about how there are millions of waves floating through the air, and like, do you know what this is doing to our brains, blah 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 blah. And she's going on about this, and her friend Becca is just staring at the TV and like whatever. And
So
eventually, what's that?
what you're saying, spoiler alert, what you're saying, spoiler alert, is that if Katie's the one rambling or Becca?
Katie.
Katie. So what you're saying is Katie, if she doesn't die, spoiler, she would have grown up to become a QAnon person for thinking about all the
Oh my girl,
conspiracy about radio waves and stuff and anti-vaxxer and all that.
girl, that escalated. I wasn't even thinking about that. You brought QAnon into our podcast. I don't know. I feel like we need some sage right now.
We need something.
Oh my goodness, I know. But anyway, yeah. So Katie's making this commentary. They don't appear to be high, actually. um, but Becca interrupts this commentary by, of course, mentioning, "Have you watched this tape?" And so this is how we make our entrance into the world of Samara and the VHS tape. Stylistically, this scene is an appreciation of its origins from the original movie. I mean, look at Becca with that long black hair just draped down her face. Becca's expression of boredom is also like an expression of lifelessness, and it seems to
Hmm.
be mirroring Samara. Um, so as Becca is talking about this mysterious videotape, Katie says, "I've seen it. I watched the tape." And Becca is like, "Okay, this was just a story I'm telling. I didn't really mean it." And then Becca's like, no, Katie is like, "But it's real. It's a real tape." And then she starts choking, and then she's like, "Just kidding." So it's a fake me out. In the first of a series of fake me outs that are in this cold open slash mini movie, there are some open doors that you expect somebody horrible to be behind the open door, and it turns out to be nobody. And I think that's an interesting tactic by Verbinski, maybe making a commentary on that particular directing choice from the horror movies that were so popular before this. And as you pointed out, Pace, we are introduced to the color of the movie, the filters that are being used, and the entire house itself seems to be covered in that bluish gray tint. And all this time it's raining outside. As I mentioned to you, I was wearing my headsets, and the sound of the rain outside was was really consistent. So sound design was so good here, and I think that this is all put to good use. We've seen all of this stuff before, Pace. The vulnerable teenager, the fake me out scare tactics, who might be hiding behind the door, nobody. But I really think that Verbinski is freshening that up for this movie, and this is such a great way for us to get into the ring. So again, spoiler alert. And folks, really, if you didn't watch this movie before the podcast, you probably should, because it'll be difficult for us to explain things without giving away details, such as Katie, who was previously joking about having watched the tape, actually did. And so, upon making this admission, this is where the action starts to pick up. And Becca suddenly disappears. And Katie is walking through the house trying to find Becca. And eventually, Katie, who was in the kitchen when she first started hearing strange things, walks back up the stairs. And, she's doing that slow walk of death. Like, she's walking to her doom. And when she finally gets upstairs in the hallway leading up to her room, this is where we start to see the water that's creeping out of her room and flooding the hallway. We hear these nature sounds, creepy chirping of some kind. And, when after you finish watching the movie, you know that these are the things that Samara must have been hearing and experiencing in the while she was trapped in the well. So Katie dies a very quick death, but it's a very obvious death. And at this point, we actually don't know what happened to Becca. Later on, we are going to find out that she ends up in a mental institution, because since Becca herself didn't watch that tape, but she was just an innocent bystander, I guess Samara doesn't kill you. She just makes you, you know, not the person you used to be. And I don't know. I think this falls under the file of a fate worse than death.
Perhaps it's weird.
I know.
It's one of those dangling plot threads in the movie that wasn't fully thought out.
Yeah,
Because she comes back later in, right? Like we
she
see her
does.
in the mental institution later on,
Right.
and she's walking behind you'll get there, I know, but I mean, she's walking
No,
behind a
no, no.
tarp,
It's
and
fine.
it's like, what does that have to do with anything else in this movie?
And you know what? The answer to your question is, again, plot device. I mean, maybe, and a lot of these characters are plot devices, characters who are there to move the story forward. But what I think is interesting about The Ring is that there's a kind of a sheen to them. There's a little bit more depth there, depth.
There's
Oh
a
yeah,
lot of death in this movie.
there
To
is a
be
lot of
fair.
depth. but, but there are layers too that I liked about this movie that you wouldn't typically find elsewhere. So our cold open is over. Katie has died, and Becca is out of the picture, and now we are introduced to Aiden, who is our child psychic, his mother Rachel, who is the news reporter played by Naomi Watts, and okay, so his father is a photographer named Noah. And as a photographer, Noah worked closely with Rachel. But for some strange reason, and I remember you were mentioning this during the screening, Pace, they keep this familial relationship vague for some strange reason.
Mhm.
Like you might immediately understand that Aiden is supposed to be Rachel's kid, but it's not explicitly said that Noah is his father until later in the movie, when Rachel kind of drops it as like this bomb. Our son, watch the tape, our son is about to die. And that's exactly what happens.
But
So
before we get there, there's even
yeah,
the scene though where Noah and Aiden come face to face outside,
right.
and of course it's raining, and of course it's blue and gray washed out.
Yes.
But like they just look at each other, and then they just kind of nod and then keep going their separate ways. And it's like, so it's clear these two know each other, but it's clear that
Yeah.
even this little kid Aiden does not like Noah, and Noah doesn't like Aiden. So
Yeah.
it kind of makes that reveal towards the end even weirder.
Very, and even that scene itself, from a storytelling standpoint, is weird. Like, you as the audience are thinking, "What was that? Why are they just randomly staring at each other in the rain?" From a visual perspective, it looked great. I thought it added to the atmosphere. These two strangers staring at each other, and the rain is pouring, and I think Aiden has an umbrella. I mean, visually, it was really interesting. And so, to bring up the what you said earlier, Pace, about Aiden's mysterious psychic powers, apparently they started to manifest before Katie died, in these disturbing drawings. Of course, all these child psychics always end up with disturbing drawings, right? Um, that Aiden drew in school, and so. One of the drawings is of a woman figure in what appears to be a grave, and Rachel thinks, "Oh, this is Katie. This is Aiden processing the grief of Katie." And of course, why would Aiden be processing the grief of Katie? Because Katie was Aiden's cousin, and
Yeah,
Ray.
and that's another weird thing about the movie, sorry to interrupt, but that's
No,
another
no, no.
weird thing is
Yeah,
that it in the establishing dialogue, they describe how close Aiden was with Katie.
right.
Like, Aiden would spend a few nights at Katie's house every week and stuff, and they'd hang out all the time, but it's like, there's like a 10-year age difference there minimum, so it's like,
Right.
how close was that really? Was Katie more like a babysitter? Like,
Yeah.
because sometimes you might babysit your younger cousin. I don't know. It just they make it sound like they're like best friends. Then we meet Aiden, and he's like 6 or 7, and Katie was clearly like 16 or something. It's like, Jesus Christ.
Yeah. Yeah. And that's absolutely valid. Like, the character sketching on here is not as final as it could be. And it's really left to the viewer to guess, how did this friendship occur, which is just what you just did just now, Pace. Um and like, one of my guesses would be, I guess Aiden was over at Katie's house so often because Rachel is a busy reporter. um so she's always out on assignment, um, or these are all contrivances, um, to make Aiden and Katie part of the world of Samara, to get them into the mystery. I'm not sure. Actually, now that you bring it up in this way, Pace, like, looking at it really critically like this, yeah, they do seem like rather odd connections, and they probably, you could
Yeah, and
critique them
like,
as contrivances.
and that gets to his psychic thing, because if he's drawing pictures of Samara in a well, it's like, how would he know that unless his cousin was telling him about what she saw on the tape, or
Right.
is he like, I don't know. You said you're gonna bring it up, so I'll wait till then. But I just find it so strange. This
Well,
whole thing with the drawings,
yeah.
all of it. It makes
Well,
sense after he watches the movie
yeah.
for him to be making those drawings, but
Right.
before he watches it, it's like, what the fuck?
Exactly. So, as you said, later on in the movie, when Rachel gets possession of the tape, of course, when she's not looking, Aiden watches the tape. And I'm going to skip over a lot of details in the walkthrough because I just want to get to the main chunks of the movie, and hopefully solve a lot of these nagging mysteries.
Yeah.
Um, so so Rachel is investigating, the mystery of how Katie died because her sister begs her to, and that's how she's pulled into the mystery of Samara. And as you watch the movie, you start, and more details about Samara's life come out. You start to see that there's this kind of a parallel between the two families. So Samara was an adopted child, and an unwanted adopted child at that. Her adoptive parents, Richard and Anna Morgan, were infertile. So they adopted Samara, and you know what? It turned out she wasn't everything they wanted in a kid. Mainly, she had that psychic imprinting thing gone, right? There's actually even a believe it or not, there's actually even a scientific term for this. Like, it's acknowledged scientifically as projected thermography.
Yeah.
Yeah. And so, like, it could be pseudoscience depending on which perspective you're coming from. But the origins of projected thermography definitely date back to, when spiritualism was big in the United
Yeah, yeah.
States.
I
Yeah,
want to talk a little bit about that during the deep dive, so we don't need to get too much into that. But yeah,
sure.
definitely we should bring that up because
Yeah,
it's really interesting. I kind of think it's fascinating. Of course, like you said, pseudoscience, most of it has
yeah.
been debunked and shown to be as just people double exposing their film or all sorts of stuff. But
Right, right, right. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, no, I definitely want to hear more of your thoughts about that. So then we find out, back to the movie. We find out that Anna was slowly losing her mind because Samara had that ability to imprint her thoughts into Anna's head. And so finally, Anna, couldn't take it anymore. She leads Samara to her death by pushing her into the well. And it is because of that, terrible unsung death that Samara becomes this vengeful spirit who wants to remind the world um, that she once existed. Uh, and the parallel I want to make by, fast forwarding to the structure of this family is that, number one, Aiden and Samara. I wouldn't say that Aiden was an unwanted child, but it is explained that he was an unplanned child. When
mhm.
Aiden mentions, uh, for some reason, Aiden is the one who mentions his conception. That's how that's how precocious this kid is. He mentions that his parents were young, quote unquote, when they had him, and so
Mhm.
that's why his parents couldn't stay together. Which leads you to think, an unplanned child and an unwanted child. There's definitely some connection there. Um, and I thought that was a really interesting structure of of the um, of the two families. But there's a lot that goes on that leads up to discovering, why Samara is this vengeful spirit that's now haunting everybody. It's kind of an epic story that spans most of Seattle, which looks absolutely depressing in the most beautiful way in this movie. And I honestly think that it's meant to evoke a little bit of the Tokyo cityscape, which also tends to have a very moody effect to it every now and then. And like, there's even one scene where Naomi Watts' character, Rachel, is standing on the balcony and she's kind of just processing all of this, like, this weird shit, let's put it that way, right? Like, she takes a smoke and she's in her processing, she's taking in, like, the apartment complex that she lives in, which is a huge multi-story apartment complex, and she's kind of just staring at everybody who lives in the units of the apartment building. And I'm wondering if that scene is like a continuation of the commentary of, like, the sort of isolated lives we all lead and the stories that might be told, but they don't stick and they end up getting forgotten.
Yeah,
Um,
that's
uh,
a very profound point.
yeah. And so, yeah, this is an epic mystery that takes them all over Seattle. At one point, they have to go to the film developing place to get pictures developed. And I remember how tickled you were by that, that idiosyncrasy that we don't do anymore. Um, I don't think anybody who was born
Yeah.
after 2000 remembers that. But yeah, and
Yep.
so eventually, they end up on an island off the coast of Seattle, and that's where they discovered that Samara and her family had lived. And Like the visual depiction of all of this, Rachel traveling on the ferry to the island, is just incredible. And I acknowledge all the story deficiencies in this movie. Um, but the visuals, I think, just make it look so good. And if nothing else, like I said, this is a good cultural artifact that depicts a certain time in American history. But I also think this movie should be preserved. Like on the sixth floor of San Francisco MoMA, where they keep all the weird video installations. um, yeah. So, and at the end of the movie is, of course, a setup for a sequel, as all of these are, um, where Aiden basically asks the question, you know. What happens next? Like, what happens to Samara? Is everyone just supposed to remember her forever? And then Aiden asked this question to Rachel, who just stares at him with this quizzical look. Cut to the director's name, there's going to be a sequel.
Yep, and eventually there were, and they were not good.
Yeah. Well, and the Ring 2 was decent, and then everything afterward was just ugh. So, yeah,
What's interest-
there's
yeah,
my run through.
and of course, this has become this huge franchise in Japan to the point where they even had a crossover between what
Yes.
in America they call the Grudge, the Ghost from the Grudge,
Yeah.
and the Ring, and they had this crossover where the two of them fight each other in like a Freddy versus Jason thing.
Right.
And the books it's based off of, there are I think 5 or 6 in that book series, so it's like there is definitely a story there that keeps going on after the original Ring, but as is often the case when stuff is brought over to the States, a lot tends to be lost in translation. And I think that the American Ring franchise took a very different direction than the Japanese Ring franchise.
I see that, and it's kind of a bummer for me because as a standalone movie, The Ring 2002 is a very meaningful movie. It's this dead kid who, none of us has a choice to be in this world, right? And so Samara is this kid, like all of us, who doesn't have a choice to be in this world, but also got saddled with these powers, and you could look at that as a parallel, of a lot of physical inconveniences that have caused parents to abandon their kids, right?
Mhm.
And so, like, that alone, and you throw in the vengeful spirit thing, it makes for a really good entertainment, but it has some meaning, and that gets diluted, of course, with sequels and capitalism wanting to squeeze every penny
Yeah.
out of the movies. Yeah, so and that's The Ring. It's a fairly quick watch.
Yeah.
But it says a lot during that time, and if nothing else, you could watch this movie on mute just for the images, and I think those alone would tell the story. But you'd be missing out
Yeah.
on Hans Zimmer's great score.
Yeah, I have to say the score, like the partnership between Hans Zimmer and Gore Verbinski, of course, is most famous for the score and the Pirates of the Caribbean films.
Mm,
But I mean, you can see some of that brilliance here, and like you
yeah.
were saying, the visuals of this film and stuff. It's a very visual heavy film, and like even the VHS tape,
Hmm.
that footage is really well shot. So it's like that part, even by itself, is just creepy. The movie within the movie of
Yeah.
Samara's memories that have been printed onto this VHS tape are just so creepy and really well done.
Yeah.
And I remember that being part of the part of the movie that creeped me out the most was not like the plot of the meta narrative of Naomi Watts trying to figure out who Samara was, but just Samara's story, and the VHS tape itself was what was really scary for me
Right.
as a kid, I remember.
And to add to that, a frustrating addition, unfortunately. But so if Samara is an adopted child who is saddled with these powers, that begs the question: who are her birth parents? Did they
Right?
have these powers? Is there a whole family of projected thermographists lurking in the world?
Right? That's an interesting story that I wanna know too,
I
like a
know.
prequel to The Ring. Isn't there a prequel in the Japanese version
Is there?
franchise?
I
I
don't
think there
know.
is, I'm not sure.
Yeah.
Um, Maybe our audience will know better,
Yeah.
so write in if that's the case, 'cause I'm curious, and it
Let us
might be
know.
fun to explore some of the other entries,
Yeah.
at some point in the future.
Well, and so this is the thing too, Pace. This is my main takeaway from the movie. Um, Interestingly, I'm not that interested in The Ring as a franchise. I saw The Ring 2 out of obligation, just because I really liked the first one. Oh, I sat through Rings, the ill-fated third sequel that came out a few years ago. Oh my gosh, that was a disaster. Um,
Mm, mhm.
but I would prefer to appreciate, at least from the American adaptation, The Ring 2002 is a single standalone, really good horror movie.
Yeah, yeah, that's fair too. Because it does leave there's a lot of, like, unanswered questions that, like we were talking about, like, whether or not Aiden is psychic.
Yeah,
Like, those kind of things that a good horror movie, I think that's well written and well thought out can kind of leave a lot of stuff that are left unanswered, like,
sure.
who was Tamara before she was,
Right.
adopted, stuff like that, who are her birth parents. So I do think that that's kind of I like some of that, and I just my question is how much of that is intentionally left vague versus how much is just them trying to make a story work without necessarily doing the work to make it work.
Well, and that brings up a really good point too. Is like, when do you use backstory? When is it appropriate, especially in horror, which is a very particular genre. Let's just put it that way, right? Like, you have to make some intentional choices to make a horror movie work. Otherwise, it could just be either corny or saddled down with exposition. And so, with the Halloween franchise, it's pretty much established that we're not that interested in Michael's background as much as we are in, how to defeat him, right?
Mhm.
But then the Conjuring series takes a different route. Like, they have some prequel movies, right?
Oh, yeah.
Yeah. So in their case that worked. I mean, I don't know if it would work with The Ring. As I said, I'm very leery about its existence as a franchise. But let me tell you this. If it were to be remade, or if it were to have a prequel addition to Gore Verbinski's movie, I would want Mike Flanagan to do it. He would be the perfect choice for this, and he should make it into a Netflix series. Yeah.
Interesting. I could see that. And what I would love is if they wanted to do that to do a closer adaptation of the books, because from what I remember, I have not read the books myself,
Yeah.
but I do know that the Japanese Ring franchise at least begins closer to the books. I don't know if it go how much it veers off it because that franchise is still going. There's a movie that came out just a year or two ago, and
Really?
yeah, so I don't know how much has continued from that, but it'd be interesting. I always find it interesting when one of the things I like about Michael Flanagan's work is that really he does really innovative uh adaptations of source material into something that feels very modern and very much of today, but also is still very tied closely to the source material.
Yeah.
So I think that'd be an interesting take on it.
Well, and another point is that American cinema has seemed to, I don't know, wander away from the novelty of Asian horror. There are not many American movies that are being remade from the Asian horror genre, and there are even original American movies aren't necessarily being made in that style anymore. As you mentioned, um, torture porn, becomes more of the thing that horror is into. And I noticed that more recently, within the last couple of years, I think there's something. that I'd like to call a Stranger Things effect, right? So, Stranger
Mm.
Things, the popular Netflix show, a lot of people, when they saw the remake of it, automatically thought, oh, it's about a bunch of kids, solving a horror, mystery. It's just like Stranger Things. But I think it's a bigger phenomenon than that. I think horror now is at an ensemble point where we're trying to get the perspectives of different people who are involved in one horrific situation, which I think is what Mike Flanagan is really good at. The Haunting of Hill House was just a
Mhm.
sprawling epic horror story, and what made it work is that it's being that horror is being experienced so differently from all of these characters. And he tried to replicate that success again with I can't even remember its name anymore. It was so disappointing.
The Haunting of Bly Manor.
Yeah,
The
Bly
sequel
Manor, and
to
it just wasn't as effective. But I still believe in Mr. Flanagan, who if you're
yeah.
listening, come on our show.
And he did this great movie, I believe that was him. Let me just quick look this up. But Oculus, that's it. Oculus.
Yes, he's
That
famous
is
for
a
that
really
too.
creepy ass movie. So, I definitely and Doctor Sleep, which was another great movie. A lot
It
of great
was.
Stephen King adaptations.
Yeah,
So,
yeah. No, I really like Doctor Sleep.
so anyway, are we ready for a deep dive?
We are. And you hinted at some really interesting notes about spiritualism.
Yeah, so there are two things that basically I wanted to touch on, and it's more maybe you have more like religious imagery in the film you want to pull out it, more our typical fare, but I was kind of inspired to do more comparative theology
Hmm.
for this and talk about two things. First is the trope of vengeful spirits.
Mm.
uh, so this is a big trope in Japanese horror, which we get with characters like from The Grudge and The Ring and stuff like that. It's called Anyo, I believe is the Japanese pronunciation. I had to look that up on the internet, so please forgive me if I'm saying it wrong. I
Hmm.
um but it's kind of this spirit that was wronged in life, typically a woman, is killed and then comes back for revenge, and their kind of spiritual powers as ghosts range from just kind of like what we would consider like poltergeist kind of
Mm.
mischief to actually like causing famines and plagues and stuff like that. uh and they typically look like Samara in this, with the really long black hair, dark
Yeah.
hair, very pale skin, that kind of thing. And so we, if you've seen like any of these any of the American remakes of this genre of
Mm.
film, like The Grudge or anything, you'd probably recognize quickly the imagery that it is part of it. And so there are other vengeful spirits, not really in the Bible, but there is from the medieval era in Jewish
Mm.
kind of tradition. There's a Dybbuk,
Mm.
which is more of a possession by an evil spirit
Yeah.
trying to get revenge, and it kind of replaces the demon possession in ancient Near Eastern cosmology, which we see more in the Bible than.
Eh,
So in the Bible,
yeah.
ghosts aren't much of a thing, and I'm going to talk about the
Right.
ghosts in the Bible quickly. But um so you wouldn't be possessed by a ghost or anything
Right.
like that, or haunted by a ghost so much as you would be possessed by a demon or some other malevolent spirit. But by the medieval era, that was changing a little bit in
Yeah.
um
With
pockets of Jewish cosmology.
Yes, I was just gonna bring that up. The die book. Die book. Is that
Mhm.
right? So there are two things I know about that phenomenon. Number one, they're literally supposed to be scary as shit. I did a little reading on them some years ago, and this is a supernatural phenomenon that means business. I would never I would never mess with that. Number two, you were right on the money by mentioning Jewish cosmology, because the die book. I'm so sorry, I'm saying it wrong, but it became less important going forward in Jewish tradition. There was an intentional movement by rabbis to kind of minimize it in the in the rabbinical literature because they did
Mhm.
not want Judaism to be so, I don't know, like mystical or other world. They wanted a more grounded
Yeah.
tradition. I
Mhm.
don't know if I'm getting that right, but there was this move to kind of minimize that phenomenon, the Dybbuk character.
Yeah. And I we see this a lot in Christianity too. I could talk about the ghosts in the Bible, and Christianity really tries to downplay kind of the supernatural,
Mm-hmm.
the non-divine inspired supernatural events in the Bible. Because if you have this really high theology where only God has any sort of agency, or maybe Satan does too, over the world,
Yeah.
over the happenings of the world and goings on of the world, then that doesn't leave space for things like ghosts and all this other stuff. So kind of ghosts have been a thorn in the side of Christianity for a long time. But even so, we get stuff like La Lorna, which is kind of a similar vengeful spirit coming out of Latin America, particularly parts of Mexico, which kind of has some Catholic infusion in with that, in with some of those tales. And then we get from Europe, we get by the time of Shakespeare and stuff, we start to see vengeful spirits like the ghost of Hamlet's father, who comes back in Hamlet and stuff like that. So
Yeah.
kind of this evolution where many cultures have this kind of vengeful spirit trope. What's interesting though is how much of American, because of the ring and stuff like that, how much of American thinking about this kind of vengeful spirit borrows a lot from the Anyo of Japan
Mm-hmm.
because of movies like The Ring and stuff. But quick, some ghosts in the Bible. There are three that I know of. Maybe other people know of more,
Mm.
but perhaps the most famous is Saul goes
Yes.
to the witch of Endor in First Samuel 28, and
Yes.
she brings back the ghost of Samuel, who is a prophet. And Samuel basically tells Saul that he's going to die going against the Philistines the next day, or whenever that battle is going to be, and David's going to replace him. And that's, lo and behold, that's what happens. And then in the New Testament, there are two references to ghosts, but they're not necessarily ghosts.
Mm-hmm.
In the Transfiguration, Elijah and Moses appear alongside Jesus, and the disciples think
Right.
that they might be ghosts, and maybe they are. Who, we don't know. And then the disciples thinking Jesus was a ghost. Which, shout out to our sister podcast Nerds at Church,
Mm.
their episode on Easter 2, Luke 24. Joe and I
Mm.
were guests on that episode, and we talk about whether or
Wow.
not Jesus was
Yeah.
a ghost. So definitely listen
Yeah.
to that. So there's a little bit of ghost there. And then the other thing they were talking about is spiritualism. Um the one of the powers that Samara has, as you said, you what was the term you use? It's slightly different than the term I found in my research.
Projected thermography.
Projected thermography. Okay. So the term I found was thoughtography, which
That's an
kind
early
of
term. Yeah.
spiritual. And then nensha is the Japanese term for this, but basically it's the psychic ability to project one's thoughts onto, in particular, photographs,
Hmm.
videos, audio, stuff. So if you hear any spooky sounds in the background of our podcast, it might be a
Hmm.
ghost imprinting their psychic visions onto
Hi,
our podcast.
ghosts.
Yep. So of course that kind of, like you said, kind of was given rise to out of spiritualism. And I just want to talk about briefly in the Bible how there there isn't much room for the Bible is kind of weird about its interpretation of what is
Right.
within the realms of possibility for humans to do. Of course, God can work through people and create miracles, and we see that a lot in the Bible. But far as psychic phenomena in the Bible,
Yeah.
we have prophets, which basically were inspired by God's word to be able to not predict the future. That's a common misconception, but in biblical
Right.
prophecy, it wasn't about predicting the future so much as it was about God giving people a particular message.
Hmm.
And that message was usually timely, about what was happening in the world and basically saying either do follow what God wants you to do, or these will be the consequences.
Right.
Or if you do follow what God wants you to do, these are the good consequences that will happen. And
Hmm.
so it's kind of more of a warning situation than a saying than the way we think of prophecy as kind of you can predict something happens in the future. And
Right.
that's not biblical prophecy per se. There's a little bit of that, but it's more about um particularly like if you think of some of the minor prophets, there's a lot of like do God's mission in the world, which involves social justice and do
Hmm.
good for people and your neighbors. And if you do that, then God will bring prosperity. If you don't, then you're going to get captured by the Babylonians or something like that. And so that,
Right.
and then that would come to pass. And so that's kind of like the prophetic aspect of it. Um, and then the other thing is we get some kind of version of psychic phenomena in stories like Joseph with his dreams,
Yeah.
and how he was able to predict. Well, he was able. The what's interesting about this Joseph story
Mm.
is not that Joseph had an ability to dream about the future. It's that everybody apparently can dream about the future, but only Joseph could interpret those dreams in a way
Oh.
that made sense. So the Pharaoh is able to dream about the upcoming famine, but it is Joseph who is able to interpret it and say, no, this is what it's about. It's about a famine that's coming. So that's an interesting thing about the Bible is that it seems to the at least the story of Joseph seems to indicate that when you dream, your dreams may be predicting the future. You just don't know what it means unless you have a God gifted interpreter who can help you interpret what it means.
Right.
So,
Right.
um, yeah, but that's my long rambling theological dive for the day. What do you have?
Well, you're talking about Joseph who was able to interpret the dreams, right? Is this the same Joseph who's Rachel's son?
Joseph, Rachel's son. Yes, very. Oh, so
Right?
maybe Aiden is supposed to be kind of connected to that.
That's what I'm wondering because I had noticed that the names of Naomi Watts' character and the sister are Rachel and Ruth. And I'm like, did the screenwriter know that? So yeah, I was kind of thinking about that.
I
It's
love that.
it's an interesting. But yeah, no, the thing about the Bible not leaving any room for supernatural possibility, or rather anything, anything that might involve something God didn't do. That's what we get in the scriptures that are circulated today, right? And I would
Yeah.
just I would really be curious in finding source texts, or applying new ways of interpreting the text. Um, because if there are these few potent examples of supernatural activity in the Bible, I feel like there could have been more, and it could
Well,
have
yeah,
been edited out. Yeah.
you said something that I think is key here, which is the way it's been interpreted, because the
Mm,
Bible does have it is kind of a lot of this stuff is a gray area. They don't there is not a consistent theology in the Bible. Each book kind of has its own theology, and some books have several because it's passed through several hands of editors and stuff like that. So we kind of get this mismatch, and then it's only Christianity and parts of Judaism, but especially Christianity, that will try to interpret this kind of consistent theology throughout the Bible. And that
right.
really kind of started in the late medieval era in history, where that kind of became. Before that, the Bible was kind of seen both in Jewish and Christian circles as more of an allegorical thing. So basically,
Right.
there's a surface meaning of a text, which may have been actually what happened. Like the story of Abraham potentially literally happened that way, but that wasn't relevant to the interpreters of the Bible. What was more relevant was this deeper spiritual meaning, and that kind of went
Mm,
away in the Reformation. But this
mhm.
is a tangent, but it's getting to a point. But what you say is very interesting, because there are all sorts of references throughout the Bible to this kind of broader sense of cosmology than what contemporary Christianity lets the Bible have.
Mm,
So, for instance, in the story of Moses, when Moses is going off against the e- Egyptian, the Pharaoh's prophets, essentially, they are also doing supernatural signs, which their gods, the Egypt's gods are said to be responsible for, which implies
Hmm.
that the Egyptian gods and cosmology is real. And
Yeah.
then it and then how they solve this is by saying that God of Abraham and Isaac, Moses' God, is the ultimate God who is more powerful than the Egyptian gods, and through some sort of divine war is able to punish the there's even this line in Exodus about how um Israel's God punishes the gods of Egypt. Who
Mm.
would he be punishing if there weren't actual gods to punish? So
Mm.
it kind of implies that there's this kind of greater sense of spiritualism and
Right.
cosmology than contemporary interpretation gives credit for.
Sure.
And then the other thing that I want to talk about too that you referenced real quick is how there's a lot of intertestamental books, and so there's called the pseudepigrapha, which is
Ah,
basically a
right.
fancy word for all these intertestamental books written, um, which are basic. Some of it made it into some Bibles. So you have, like, for instance, the Apocrypha in many Roman Catholic Bibles and some Orthodox Bibles, and it kind of varies which tradition you're using. So some of that is pseudepigrapha, but the pseudepigrapha, there are like literally dozens, maybe even hundreds of non canon books that were
Hmm.
important to the Israelites in the time that Jesus was alive.
Yeah.
But they just, for whatever reason, were not collected into what has become canon. And then we also have that the New Testament with the Nag Hammadi, is the name of the place where these scriptures were found. But
Mm.
basically, sometimes you'll hear them called as the Gnostic Gospels. So
Right.
once again, we have this collection of scripture that has all sorts of um, interesting stuff in it, but for whatever reason isn't considered canon. And the reason a lot of this stuff isn't considered canon, well, one of the reasons, there's not a singular reason, but
Hmm.
one of the reasons that some of the stuff isn't considered canon is because it has theology or claims, paranormal or supernatural claims, that are inconsistent with the rest of scripture.
Mm.
So exactly like you're saying, we get a lot of kind of interesting looks at the shape of the cosmos and stuff like this. In, like,
Hmm.
for instance, the book of Enoch, he goes into heaven and he gives us this whole thing
Yeah.
about all the different layers of heaven and stuff,
Yeah.
which doesn't make it into the Bible.
Right.
And yet, even though it's not in the Bible, it still kind of influences popular notions of heaven by having these big pearly gates and stuff like that. A lot
Mm.
of that imagery comes from the pseudepigrapha or Gnostic Gospels, and they aren't necessarily scriptural, but yet we think of them as scriptural even though they're not.
Wow. So I know of the Book of Enoch, but I'm not. I haven't read it, and so it does have those vivid descriptions of heaven that are now popular. Really?
Some of there are several books of Enoch, and I have not read these in so long. I took a class in my master's program on the
Hmm.
pseudepigrapha, so we did deep dives into a lot of
Yeah.
the books. But a lot of I can't say specifically what is from what book, but I can say that a lot of the popular notions of how we think of hell, how we think of Lucifer or Satan, and how we think of heaven kind of are influenced from these. That's not to say there's a one-to-one correspondence, but there
Yeah.
definitely seems to be influence from the pseudepigrapha and how we think of heaven and hell and all that stuff.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. Yeah. I mean, there's a lot that isn't included in the official canon, which is, disappointing, right? And certainly there are a lot of historical reasons for that. But in the scripture that we do have, that's presented to us as is now, there's still some interesting things to point out. That, why is that there? Why does that? And what does that mean? And then when you ask those questions, you think to yourself, not a lot of people think about that. For example,
Yeah.
you've seen a couple of mentions in the Hebrew Testament of casting lots. And
Mm-hmm.
it's my understanding that this is just like rolling dice. Is that a correct
Yeah.
interpretation?
Yeah, and we
So,
even get it. The disciples even do it in the book of Acts, so it's not just the Hebrew scriptures, but it even makes it into
ah,
the New Testament.
yes. Oh, so it did. Okay, it made it into the New Testament. So, what is happening there? Like, we're relying on chance, or is God's hand at work? at
yeah,
making the results of the die.
that's the question,
Yeah.
and it seems that the disciples, because they cast lots in Acts to decide who would replace Judas, the person who betrayed Jesus.
Mm-hmm.
Since Judas committed suicide, they wanted to keep the number of 12. So they cast lots, and I believe Matthias is the person who replaced Judas. But
Mm.
they cast lots to make that decision. So I think their thinking was that God would choose the outcome base, and it wouldn't be chance, but like God would push the dice in a direction or something, kind of like that scene in the Phantom Menace Star Wars when Qui-Gon uses the Force to move the die.
Oh my goodness. So what you're saying what you're saying is God is what is the word for where the force comes from? Mitochondria or something?
Yeah.
um but no, and it's things like, the casting of lots that throw kind of maybe not a wrench, but maybe a ripple in the understanding and our cosmological understanding that God is supposed to be at work at all times. And
Mhm.
so like when the point I'm trying to get at is when you roll the dice, right? When you casting the lots, I feel like you're sort of accessing God's power by doing that. It's like you're casting a lot. You may as well be casting a spell because you're using those objects and that motion to release the objects to tap into the divine, which is contradictory um, to Christian cosmology. We're not supposed to have that kind of control. We're not supposed to
Yeah.
have that kind of access.
And what's really interesting is, of course, if you look throughout history, we of course have the official theology of the church, which is, even that is hard to say, because
Yeah.
if you go through any tradition, not just Catholicism gets a bad rap, apologies to Joe, but like if you go through the encyclicals of Catholicism and stuff, you'll find all sorts of contradictions, even though the
Yeah.
church's official teaching is saying that no, it's the theology has been consistent throughout the past 2,000 years.
Yeah.
But that's not just exclusive to Catholicism, that's all the traditions within
Right.
Christianity. So you have an official theology, which tends to say there is no such thing as divinization, there's no such thing as
Right. Right.
um, any sort of supernatural outside of uh, God, outside of God's doing, or the devil's
Yes.
doing, or Satan, or any of that stuff. But throughout history, you have examples of um kings and queens, like even Ronald Reagan, for fuck's sake, who would go to like people like fortune tellers and stuff, even though they're devout Christians, but would
Oh,
go to fortune tellers
girl,
and
that was
try
all
to get.
Nancy. She was into that astrology stuff.
But that's what I mean, like
Yeah.
there's always been kind of this current that goes against the church's teaching,
Yeah.
official teachings about the place of supernaturalism in the church, and which is why you can get a lot of psychics and stuff might do what they call like light work or miracle work or angel work, where they're calling on Christian angels to help
Mm.
inspire their tarot reading or something like that. And so it's like this mixing and
Yeah.
amalgamation of all these different traditions, these spiritual traditions and Christian traditions and stuff. And to get a little bit geeky, because we are nerds at church, there
This is
a
interesting.
term that we can use for that is the liminal space that
Ah,
occurs in a
right.
post-colonial world
Yeah.
from. And Christianity colonized Europe first, so I'm not saying that there is that. So I'm saying that even within European traditions of Christianity, there are these liminal spaces too, where you have local customs and traditions. Like you have, for instance, the whole notion of vampires, which kind of comes from Central Europe, how they react to things like Christian symbolism. There is no vampire in the Bible. That's completely made up. But it's this kind of amalgamation
That's the
of this
quote of the
Christian
day.
theology. And well, yeah, but you get this Christian theology mixing with these kind of folk traditions, and that's what creates
Right.
the mythology around vampires. And you do that on a global scale, because colonialism, unfortunately, is a global phenomena. And um, And so we get these really interesting things like La Lorna, for instance, this
Mhm.
like I referenced earlier, of these interesting mixtures of local folk tales and customs and stuff like that that kind of merge with Christianity or with some other mainline or other global religious traditions, not just Christianity. But so you kind of get all that, and it's just very interesting and fascinating. And no matter how much the church tries to control it, and I'm
Right.
talking about all the churches as an institution, there's always room for this creativity and these mixtures of supernatural and Christian and folk and all that stuff. So
And there's no need for you to apologize about Catholicism because the its tactic for ballooning to 1 billion members worldwide is that they sort of tolerate the indigenous traditions of the societies that they
mhm.
assimilated into the church. My Trekkie is coming out, and I say that from experience. As a Filipino Catholic, many of our old ways still exist, and from my engagement with the church in the Philippines, um, there is an acceptance. It's kind of like on the level of an open secret. Like there's this acceptance that there's for us Filipino Catholics this version of Jesus that has more of a mysterious, mystical bent because of our old tradition, our old pre-Catholic traditions. So, no matter colonialism will do what it can to overtake you, but the pre-colonial ways always find a way to survive. Um, and on that note, since we are talking about vengeful spirits, and we just reviewed a movie about a vengeful spirit. There's a vengeful spirit right now manifesting in our chat box, in the form of our dear editor Matt, who's telling us that we need to STF you.
Yes, we are getting close to our 2 hour limit, which is we've had a few episodes that surpassed the 2 hour limit, but we
Yeah.
should try to keep it
But
wrapped up.
in terms of vengeful spirits, Matt is one of the more adorable ones. Like I wouldn't want to have a seance to cast Matt out. I'd be like, oh, you're such a cute little vengeful spirit. Come here, let me pinch your cheeks, vengeful spirit. Okay, no,
Let's rate the film, and if there's a favorite kill, there aren't many kills in this movie,
there's
but we
not.
can at least, or
Yeah.
yeah, go for it. How would you rate the film?
For me, 8 out of 10. I so want to give it a 10 out of 10, but there are just too many lingering questions that kind of are distracting. But 8 out of 10. Yeah, favorite kill. There's not a lot to choose from. I guess I would have to say Katie. Katie getting murdered because this does that count as a murder if a ghost is your murderer? Well, anyway,
Yeah.
the setup for her kill was interesting, and I also like the subtle ways that Verbinski portrayed the consequence of her death because it was
Mhm.
mysterious, right? Nobody's gonna say she was killed by a ghost. In the funeral, if you watch the funeral scene, and pay attention to the dialogue of some of the extras, people are whispering about how she died. They're saying, "Did she do drugs? And why do they have a closed casket? Like, how badly was she murdered?" So all of those put together, I would have to vote for Katie.
Yeah, I think interesting. I think for me, the movie is a 7 out of 10. It's good. Not
Mm,
my favorite. It's like, but it's good and it's compelling to watch. And it was fun to rewatch after however many years, 20 some years,
yeah.
about 20 years. Weird to think that next year will be the 20th anniversary of the movie,
Oh my Lanta.
right?
Oh my
Let's not think
gosh.
about that.
Can you let me see. Choose your poison. Choose your poison. Do I want to be reminded of how elderly I am, or do I want Samara to come at me? Hmm.
Come at me, Mara. Um, but yeah, I have to say my favorite kill is probably Noah because it's at the end of the movie. You're expecting there to be a
Yeah.
twist, but the movie's kind of setting up this happy ending that Noah and Rachel are going to get
Yes.
back together and all this stuff. And
Yes.
then just out of left field, he dies, and then we find out,
Yes.
oh, the movie's not over. The curse isn't broken.
Right.
And then we
Right.
find out from Rachel, like you're saying in your description, Joe, that you have to copy the tape and give it to
Yeah.
somebody else. in order
Yeah.
to not die. So
I like the scene where Noah is explaining to Aiden why he's a shitty father, and then he basically says, "Yeah, I'm a shitty father, but I want to be your father," And I'm like, "Oh, that's so nice." My one concluding thought about the movie is, I love all the theological angles that directions that we went. But the main theological angle for me is the one that's also the most obvious to anyone who is not religious or not theological, and that's the concept of memory. This is what all Samara wants: is that people to remember that she was once here. And that is the basis for so many of our religious traditions and
mhm,
storytelling traditions.
I agree.
Yeah.
And speaking of that, I guess our next movie
Hmm?
is maybe you remember this or maybe you don't. Event Horizon from 1997, which I'm
Yes.
really excited to dig into.
Yeah, me
I've
too.
already watched the movie. I had not seen it before I screened it, but I want to screen it again with Joe because we didn't get a chance to watch it.
Yeah.
Because I think it'll be fun to watch it with somebody because the movie is very strange, um, but in a good way. So we'll talk about that next week. So definitely
That's
come back for that.
another one of the movies I liked in high school. Oh my, this podcast is reminding me that I'm 100 years old.
I know we're so ancient. We're the elders. Okay. Well, are you ready for the outro or any other concluding thoughts before we get there?
Yeah, I think we're gonna wrap it up. We are way over time, as our
Yep.
adorable vengeful spirit keeps reminding us in the chat box.
Yep. Okay, well, that's it for our show. Our theme music was written by the vengeful spirit, Matthew May, who also has the unfortunate task of editing this balloon 2 hour long episode.
That's why Matt is
Um,
vengeful.
yep. Horror Nerds at Church releases every Thursday. Please comment, rate, and subscribe to us on Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, Stitcher, or wherever you get your podcasts. Follow us on social media, Facebook and Instagram at Horror Nerds at Church and Twitter at HNAC Pod for all the latest updates about upcoming films, news, and other announcements. Until next time, if you find a VHS tape in a video loan library of a weird hotel, first of all, good luck trying to find something to play it on. But if you are able to play it and it looks creepy, shut that shit off. Don't just watch it till the end. That's how people die. Anyway, till next time,
Assuming you even know what that thing is. Till
right?
next time.
If you're born after 2000 and you get this black box with these two little white stickers in it, and you're like, what the fuck is this?
Yeah.
Don't even bother. Just throw it in the trash. Okay. Bye. Bye for everyone.
Bye.